Okay, this regards the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we have covered the building of the wall and the Cold War before and the Iron Curtain. But this was the Berlin Wall, which had been built in 1961 and lasted till 1989. And this discussion is how the wall fell and the dramatic changes in not just U.S. history, but one of the great changes in world history in the recent centuries. So the fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War occurred, and three of the most important people are in this slide. Gorbachev, very important, the leader of the Soviets, President Reagan, and yeah, and Bush to a lesser extent. So first, we look here at Ronald Reagan, who was a very strong president as far as foreign policy goes. And he went and visited the wall in 87. And like you see here, he says, General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. And the famous quote is, Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And there's another shot of Reagan right at the wall. On the other side of that barrier is you have East Berlin, where all of these hundreds of millions of people are really kept locked into Eastern Europe from 61 all the way to 89. So that's almost 30 years. So that's where Reagan made the famous speech. And then 2 years later, just after Reagan left the presidency, the wall did end up coming down, much to the shock of everyone in the United States, of historians, the media. No one really predicted this happening. They expected the Cold War between the democracy of the United States and the democracies versus the dictatorships and the communists. They expected it to go on much longer, but it ended in a very shocking and quick fashion. And Gorbachev was the leader of the Soviets, and he allowed it to happen. But there were many other figures that pushed him into that. One is Lech Walesa, a great union leader in Poland, and was a key figure in ending Soviet communist power. So that's Polish for solidarity, and the leader of that was Lech Walesa. You see a shot here. He basically he controlled the unions in Poland, and union workers refused to work for the Russians, for the Soviets, and because they had been tired of being under that domination for 30 years, and this drove economically the Soviets to almost go into bankruptcy because they couldn't get the dock workers to work. So really, the unions had a tremendous amount to do in Europe with ending the communist rule. Oh, another picture here of Lech Walesa. And there's Lech Walesa greeting John Paul II, the Pope at that time, one of the most popular popes of all time, really. John Paul was from Poland himself and had escaped the Nazis in World War II, and then had lived through the brutal rule of the Soviets until he escaped again, and then eventually became Pope. But he played the Pope John Paul II played a huge role in ending the Cold War too by constantly encouraging Catholics and Christians in East Germany and Eastern Europe to stand up to the Soviet leadership, and he did that through radio messages and through written communications, and he played a huge role in that. Here's John Paul, really a fabulously popular pope at the time, especially among young people across the world. But he was the other major figure that played a role in the end of the Cold War and the freedom of the people behind the Iron Curtain. Here you see there's countless shots of people celebrating and storming the walls in different areas um, to freedom. And again, Gorbachev, the leader of the Russians, could have ordered troops to fire on these people, but he didn't. And so Gorbachev, the leader of the Russians, played a big role too in allowing it to come to a peaceful end. And here you see another shot of that. So then here, the reason Bush is mentioned is because Reagan uh, ended his term as president after 8 years, and George Bush Sr. Became president and was president for a short time uh, just before the wall fell. So he's given some credit because he basically managed the situation as it was already happening for a short time. There's another shot of Pope John Paul II. But an important thing to understand too is the Cold War didn't just end in Germany, in Eastern Germany. The walls fell all. There were walls all across Eastern Europe. And all these countries were dominated by the Russians and Soviets, all the way from the end of World War II, basically till 1989. So you're talking from 1945 till 1989. And Czechoslovakia got freedom when the walls fell too, and the fences and the minefields were removed, and people from Czechoslovakia were free. Hungary is another country. I'm not going to go into all the countries, but all of these countries in Eastern Europe, not only were they free, but then they elected their own leaders as a democracy instead of having the Soviets install dictatorships, and as the Soviets had done for 30 years. Actually, more like 40 years, even before the walls were built. So the iron, this is the Hungary turns the Iron Curtain into scrap. You can see this isn't a wall, but these type of barbed wire fences were torn down over thousands of miles of land. You can see people all wanting to leave East Berlin because of freedom. Now they had freedom to worship and freedom to choose their own jobs, and also looking for a place for better economies. So you had a huge influx of um, refugees leaving Eastern Berlin to go into the West. But meanwhile, like we talk about how Gorbachev peacefully allowed this ending to happen, but quite differently in the dictatorship of China, a totalitarian power at the time also. When students also in '89 tried to also create freedom through protest, uh, the Chinese government just harshly put them down with brutal force. And then they sent, unlike Gorbachev, they sent in the military and violently put down the demonstrations of protesters, and really ran over them with tanks and shot them down, and ended that attempt at freedom in China. So that was quite a different ending at the same time. You see here, Washington Post troops roll through Beijing to crush protesters. And it says hundreds, but it turned out to be way more than that were killed. Okay, so the failed attempt at gaining freedom in China did not happen, but in Europe it was successful. To this day, China is still a dictatorship. But here you see in the east, in Europe, East Germany's flooding to the west, and another shot here in Bulgaria. And all of these countries had then new presidents. In Czechoslovakia, it was called the Velvet Revolution, where a playwright was elected president. So it was a major change in their form of government. So the Cold War, which basically went from 1947, from the time of Truman, who wanted to contain communism, all the way until 1991, when it ended. And the major ending of this began with the fall of the walls and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.